Somewhere in America, a rancher is selling a truckload of cattle he spent 2.5 years raising. He fed them through drought. He paid double for hay. He watched interest rates eat into his margins. And when he finally sells, there's a real chance only one buyer even shows up to make an offer. One buyer. For an entire truckload of an animal that took years to raise and could never be replaced overnight. That is not a coincidence. That is not bad luck. That is the structure of an industry that almost nobody thinks about until they stand at a grocery store and stare at a $22 a pound ribeye, wondering if they misread the sign. They didn't misread it. Beef really is that expensive right now. And while everyone is arguing about drought and weather and inflation, there is a much bigger story sitting quietly underneath all of it. 4 companies control more than 85% of the beef that ends in paw on your plate. 4, not 40, not 400. 4 companies stand between almost every cow in America and every dinner table in America. Their names are Tyson Foods, JBS, Cargill, and National Beef. And here's the part most people don't know. 2 of those 4, National Beef and JBS, are majority owned by a company Bass ED in Brazil. So when Americans talk about food security, about controlling their own food supply, a huge slice of the actual beef pipeline running through the United States isn't even fully in American hands. Stick with me here, because this is not a conspiracy theory. This is not some fringe internet claim. This is the United States Department of Justice, right now, in 2026, actively investigating these 4 companies for possible price fixing and anti-competitive behavior. This is the Department of Agriculture standing G at a podium saying, on the record, that ranchers have fewer and fewer places to sell their cattle, while these 4 companies grow stronger every year. This is happening in real time, and most people scrolling past their grocery receipt have no idea it's unfolding. So let's actually break down what's going on. Because the truth is more interesting, more frustrating, and more complicated than any single headline can capture. Start with the basics. When a cow leaves a ranch, it doesn't go straight to a butcher shop or a grocery store. It goes through a chain. First a feedlot, where it's fattened up on grain, then a packing plant, where it's slaughtered and hessied into the cuts you actually recognize. Steaks, ground beef, roasts. That packing stage is the choke point. That's where Tyson, JBS, Cargill, and National Beef sit, controlling the vast majority of everything that passes through. Here's what makes that dangerous for both sides of the chain. On one end, ranchers need somewhere to sell their cattle. If there are only a small handful of buyers in your region, sometimes literally 1 or 2 packing plants within reason, able driving distance, you don't have leverage. You take the price you're offered because your alternative is trucking cattle hundreds of extra miles, which eats your margin anyway. On the other end, consumers need somewhere to buy their beef, and that beef is priced by companies who control most of the supply chain from slaughter to shelf. Squeeze both ends, and you get a system where cattle producers often say they're barely breaking even in years when beef prices at the Saint, or are hitting record highs. Sit with that for a second. Record prices in the grocery store. And yet, many of the actual ranchers raising these animals are struggling to survive. If prices are that high, where is that extra money actually going? That question is exactly why federal investigators are digging in right now. Or selling their animals, the Big Four grow stronger and stronger, giving them an unprecedented ability to influence the prices paid for cattle. That's not a talking point from an activist group. That's the government's own language on the record in 2026. And this isn't coming out of nowhere. There's already real legal history here. A massive lawsuit, officially called the Cattle and Beef Antitrust Litigation, has been working its way through federal court for years, accusing these same 4 processors of conspiring to limit the supply of beef and inflate prices going back as far as 2015. The core allegation is almost cinematic in how simple it sounds. These companies, according to the lawsuit, coordinated with each other instead of competing with each other. Real competition should mean each company tries to buy more cattle and sell more beef than its rivals, pushing prices toward a fair market rate. The allegation is that instead, they quietly moved together, holding back supply, matching pricing behavior, effectively acting like a single entity instead of 4 competitors. Now, here's where I have to be straight with you, because this story deserves honesty, not exaggeration. Tyson and Cargill have already agreed to settle parts of this litigation, a combined $87.5 million to resolve claims from everyday consumers who bought beef at the grocery store between 2014 and 2019. Tyson separately agreed to pay another $82.5 million to settle claims from direct buyers like retailers. JBS agreed to pay $52.5 million in a related settlement and agreed to cooperate with the ongoing case against the others. But, and this matters, none of these companies have admitted wrongdoing, not one. These are settlements which happened for all kinds of reasons, including simply wanting to avoid the cost and risk of a prolonged trial. And 2 of the 4, JBS and National Beef, have not settled at all. They remain defendants, still fighting the case in court. So as of right now, no court has ruled that these companies illegally colluded. The investigation is active. The lawsuit is on go. The truth hasn't been fully decided yet. What we do know for certain is the scale of the settlements already paid, the scale of the market these four companies control, and the fact that the federal government considers this serious enough to launch a criminal antitrust investigation. Now let's talk about why your grocery bill actually feels like a gut punch right now. Because the concentration story and the price story are tangled together, and pulling them apart honestly is important. Here's the part almost nobody expects. The United States cattle herd right now is the smallest it has been in 75 years. Read that again. 75 years. As of the start of 2026, there were about 86 million cattle and calves in the entire country, and the number of beef cows that have actually calved dropped to its lowest level since 1961. We are currently in year 13 of what ranchers call the cattle cycle, and year 8 of straight contraction. That means the herd has been shrinking almost without pause for the better part of a decade. Why? Drought, mostly. As of recently, roughly 75% of the entire U.S. beef cow herd has been sitting in drought conditions, compared to a long-term average of around 20%. That is an enormous, almost unbelievable gap. Dry pastures mean less grass. Less grass means less free food. For cattle, and that forces ranchers to either pay far more for feed or shrink their herds to match what the land can actually support. Add rising feed costs, rising fuel costs, rising interest rates on every loan a rancher takes out, and you get an entire generation of producers who are hesitant to expand their herds even when cattle prices are historically high. And here's the twist that makes it worse. Rebuilding a cattle herd isn't like restocking a warehouse. You can't just order more cows and have them ready next quarter. If a rancher decides today to keep a female calf for breeding and so's teed of selling her, it can take 2 to 3 years before her offspring actually reaches the beef supply. Cattle have a biological clock that money can't speed up. So even if every rancher in America decided tomorrow to rebuild their herds as fast as possible, prices at the store would likely stay elevated for years, not months. On top of all that, there's been a disruption almost nobody outside the industry has heard about: the New World screwworm, a parasite that attacks livestock, which forced the USDA to halt live cattle shipments coming up from Mexico. Historically, Mexico supplied well over 1 million head of cattle to the United States every seemingly year. That trade has been sharply disrupted, right as domestic supply was already stretched thin. It's one more crack in a supply chain that had almost no slack left to give. Put all of that together, and you get numbers that genuinely shock people. Ground beef hit around $6.75 a pound this spring, up nearly 13% from the year before. Steak prices climbed to about $12.80 a pound, up 16% year over year. In some markets, a ribeye steak is running close to $22 a pound. The average retail price of beef hit a record in the spring of 2026, and the USDA is forecasting beef prices could climb another 10% or more before the year is over. Now, here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Despite all of that, Americans have not stopped buying beef, not even close. Around the 4th of July this year, beef sales actually rose by roughly 350 TR. Whoa, $1 million compared to the year before. People aren't cutting back. They're trading up, buying premium cuts, organic labels, higher grade steaks, treating beef almost like an affordable luxury, even as the price tag climbs. Restaurants selling steak are reporting more customers walking through the door, not fewer. It's a strange kind of economic stubbornness. Consumers are absorbing the pain rather than walking away from what they consider a staple of American life. So now you have two forces slamming into each other at the exact same time. On one side, a genuine, well-documented supply shortage, the smallest cattle herd in generations, drought, disrupted imports, and a biological rebuilding process that simply cannot be rushed. On the other side, a market structure where four companies, controlling the overwhelming majority of processing capacity, sit in the middle of every single transaction between the rancher and your dinner plate, and are currently under criminal investigation for how they may have used that position. To be fair to the other side of this story, plenty of agricultural economists argue the price surge is mostly, maybe even entirely, driven by that genuine scarcity, not manipulation. They point out that live cattle prices have actually risen even faster than retail beef prices, which suggests packers themselves are paying more for the animal, not just pocketing extra margin. Some analysts even note that the market share held by the largest packer, Tyson, has actually declined somewhat this year. Not everyone in the cattle industry believes concentration alone proves anything illegal happened. Havit, among four dominant companies, is not automatically a crime. Buying and processing beef efficiently at scale is, on its own, a completely legal business model, and it's the reason a lot of your groceries are affordable in the first place. in other categories where competition still functions properly. But here's the uncomfortable question that even skeptics can't fully wave away. If the concentration itself isn't the problem, why does the federal government feel the need to launch a criminal investigation into exactly these 4 companies? Why have 2 of them already agreed to pay a combined total well over $150 million in settlements, even while denying wrongdoing? Why do ranchers over and over again describe a marketplace where they feel like they have almost no leverage, sometimes facing what amounts to a single realistic buyer for their cattle in their entire region? It doesn't have to be one or the other. Both things can be true at once. There can be a real, physical, undeniable shortage of cattle driving prices upward. And layered on top of that shortage, a market structure so concentrated that 4 companies have unusual power to decide exactly how much of that shortage gets passed on to ranchers versus consumers, and exactly how much simply becomes extra profit sitting in the middle. That's not necessarily proof of a crime, but it's exactly the kind of structure that makes proving or disproving a crime so difficult. And it's exactly why investigators are looking so closely right now. There's a bigger picture behind all of this too, one that goes back over a century. Back in the early 1900s, the United States actually went through this exact fight before. Regulators investigated the meatpacking industry for anti-competitive behavior, and Congress responded by passing the Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921, specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of concentrates. Had control over the meat supply. For decades afterward, most people assumed the problem had been permanently solved. It wasn't. Slowly, quietly, over the following century, the industry consolidated again, plant by plant, merger by merger, until we ended up right back at extreme cease, not just concentration, just with different company names on the door. The United States has lost hundreds of thousands of cattle ranches since the late 1990s. Entire family operations that used to define rural American communities have simply disappeared, unable to compete or survive in a marketplace increasingly shaped by a handful of massive processors. Let's zoom out even further because there's another piece of this puzzle that rarely makes it into the headlines: the feedlots. Before cattle ever reach a packing plant, they spend months at a feedlot, being fed grain to reach the right ways. T for slaughter. You might assume the 4 big packers simply own these feedlots outright, controlling the entire pipeline top to bottom. They mostly don't. Instead, they rely heavily on supply agreements with large commercial feedlot operators. And here's the twist. Those large feedlots are growing too, at the expense of smaller ones. There are more than 26,000 D feedlots scattered across the United States. But the very largest of them, the ones capable of holding 50,000 cattle or more, now account for roughly a third of all the cattle sent to slaughter, even though they represent a tiny fraction of the total number of feedlots. Some ranchers describe this as a kind of quiet territorial arrangement, almost like each major FV. A headlot becomes informally aligned with a particular packer, which means even before an animal reaches the slaughterhouse gate, the range of buyers a rancher can realistically access has already narrowed. Layer by layer, the path from pasture to plate keeps funneling down into fewer and fewer hands. Now think about the export side of this story too, because it reveals something important about just how tight this market really is. Normally, when domestic prices rise this high, you'd expect exports to slow down, since American beef becomes less competitive on the world stage. That's exactly what's happening. U.S. beef exports have been falling because American beef has simply become too expensive for many international buyers compared to beef from other countries. At the very same time, imports have been rising, with countries like Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada shipping in more beef to help fill the gap left by our shrinking domestic herd. Imported beef now makes up close to a fifth of everything Americans eat. Even federal policymakers moved to temporarily suspend certain key import tariffs this year, specifically trying to bring in more supply and ease the pressure on prices. Ranchers, for their part, have expressed real concern about that move, worried it treats a symptom instead of the underlying disease, and worried that leaning on imports discourages the very domestic herd rebuilding the country actually needs for the long term. And then there's the ground beef problem specifically, which might be the most relatable piece of all this for anyone who just wants to make a simple weeknight dinner. Ground beef comes largely from what's called non-fed cattle, older cows and bulls being culled from herds rather than young cattle raised specifically live for steaks. That category of slaughter has fallen sharply, down double digits year over year for 4 years running now. Fewer cull cows means less of the lean trim that actually goes into a package of ground beef, which is exactly why the price of something as basic as a pound of Hamburg has climbed so aggressively, sometimes even faster than premium steak cuts. It's a strange, almost backwards twist. The humble grocery staple millions of families rely on for affordable dinners has, in some months, seen sharper price increases than the fancy cuts people associate with special occasions. So what happens next? Nobody can say for certain. The criminal investigation is active but unresolved. The lawsuit against JBS and National Beef is still working through the courts with no final verdict yet. Settlements from Tyson and Cargill have been paid out to consumers, but those settlements explicitly do not admit guilt, and they don't cover the full scope of what regulators are now examining. Meanwhile, the actual physical shortage of cattle isn't going away anytime soon. Most agricultural economists expect real relief at the grocery store may not arrive until 2028 at the earliest. And that's assuming ranchers start rebuilding their herds consistently starting now, which even that is far from guaranteed, given how expensive and risky expansion remains. What we do know is this: the next time you're standing in a grocery store, staring at the price of ground beef or steak, wondering why it feels like your money buys less meat than it used to, you're not imagining things. And you're not simply a victim of generic inflation. You're standing at the very end of an incredibly long chain that starts with a calf born on a ranch, moves through years of feeding and raising, funnels through a feedlot, and then passes through one of only 4 massive gates before it ever reaches your plate. THO's 4 gates are currently under one of the most serious federal investigations the American meat industry has seen in decades. Maybe the investigation finds nothing beyond a genuinely difficult market shaped by drought and shrinking herds. Or maybe it uncovers exactly what the lawsuits have already alleged: a coordinated effort to limit competition and protect margins at the expense of both the rancher raising the cattle and the family trying to afford dinner. Either way, one thing is already undeniable. Sitting right there in plain numbers, 4 companies control more than 85% of the beef in this country. And whatever the investigators ultimately find, that number alone should make every single person paying attention to their grocery bill stop and ask a very simple question. Who exactly decided that beef should cost this much? The cow, the drought, or the 4 companies standing in between?